This is Module 3, Lesson 2, Obstacles to Population Control. Whenever before 1945 has humanity endeavored to control the population of entire nations and of the world as a whole without committing mass murder. The obstacles they encountered were unexpected and formidable, and of three different kinds: systemic, historical, and international. Let us first look at the systemic obstacles. And the first among them is the lack of birth control and public awareness. The science and technology of birth control were in their infancy in 1945, when the United Nations was created and entrusted with the task of controlling population growth and maintaining peace. And the vast majority of the population had neither the means nor the knowledge to prevent unwanted births. At most, a third of the population in Europe and North America practiced birth control, and many of those relied on the traditional methods of rhythm, also called periodic abstinence, withdrawal, also called coitus interruptus, douching, and prolonged breastfeeding, which have a very high failure rate, but were the only forms of birth control condoned for married couples. Diaphragms, contraceptive sponges, condoms, and spermicides were available in the cities, but they are rudimentary and not in wide use. The pill and IUDs, intrauterine devices, had not yet been invented, and legal barriers to condom use were not removed until the 1960s and 1970s. The second systemic obstacle to overtly controlling population growth is Christianity, and especially the doctrine of papal infallibility. Neither contraception nor abortion was legal or morally acceptable to the mainstream, and both met with staunch opposition from conservative and religious elements of society. Sexual gratification without the goal of reproduction was considered immoral, and legislatures refused to legalize any forms of birth control or to even remove obscenity laws from their statutes so the issues could be openly discussed and the public educated. Social acceptance of contraception was still decades away, while abortion is to this day a controversial topic. While the Anglican Church sanctioned the use of birth control by married couples in 1930, and the Federal Council of Churches followed suit in the US in 1931, the Roman Catholic Church and most other Christian denominations took a firm stance against all forms of artificial birth control and has not reversed its position. Hampered by the immutability of the doctrine of papal infallibility, by which the Vatican since 1870 has claimed that the Pope is the ultimate moral authority in the Christian world and preserved from the possibility of error, the papacy could not alter the course once the Church had committed itself against birth control. And as the Holy See commands the respect of 1 billion Christians, the population control lobby had come to a dead end. The third systemic obstacle is the democratic process itself. The democratic process stood in the way of legalizing birth control, let alone legislating family size, as no politician could hope to be elected on a platform of government interference with people's reproductive freedom. The process of seeing contraception as an issue of public health rather than one of morals had started after World War I, but did not reach critical mass until the early 1950s due to efforts initiated by the United Nations. Elected officials and politicians could not and did not seek to convince the public that unless strict population control measures are adopted immediately and universally, society would face nuclear war in the near future or would collapse in 2 or 3 generations from famine. They were held back by self-serving reasons, as it would have meant the end of their political ambitions and careers, as well as by conservative values that define the governing class. It would have come as a great shock to the architects of the global depopulation policy that the most valued aspects of Western society, namely Christianity and democracy, stood in the way of their plans to keep the peace by limiting family size. Yet democracy and Christianity proved to be insurmountable obstacles to man's noblest and most civilized way to ensure peace and prosperity for all. Paradoxically, had it not been for the intractability of church leaders of all Christian denominations, but Catholics in particular, and for the unelectability of politicians in a democratic system, the global depopulation policy would not have been driven underground, to be carried out by deception through covert chemical and biological means, but could have proceeded in the open and by freely given consent, and thus be legislated. As it became clear that the systemic obstacles could not be overcome at the national level, the responsibility to introduce effective population control measures was transferred to the international arena and placed onto the United Nations. To circumvent these formidable systemic obstacles, the architects of the global depopulation policy realized that they had to deceive the world in order to move the masses to do what is needed against their will and without their knowledge. And that is how the stage was set for history's greatest deception. The crimes committed behind the veil of secrecy that was raised to shield the global depopulation policy from public scrutiny and accountability for over 60 years are without parallel in history by virtue of their sheer magnitude. While these crimes have been committed not with malevolent but with benevolent intent to save humanity from its own ignorance and indifference, they nevertheless redefine the concept of crimes against humanity and throw our species into an entirely different and unflattering light. Now on to historical obstacles. Every generation lives and operates within the confines of its time and is at the mercy of history. But the political climate at the end of World War II was volatile and charged with hatred and bitterness. Europe and Japan were laid waste, and economic conditions were dire everywhere. But there was no time for subtle measures. Desperate times called for desperate measures. The first historical obstacle was that of the Allies versus Axis powers, the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers and their use as guinea pigs. The Allies won the Second World War, and its members, who call themselves the United Nations, became signatories of the Declaration of the United Nations and members of the newly formed United Nations organization at war's end. The United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, the so-called Big Three, controlled Allied policy during the war and dictated the United Nations policy after the war. The unconditional surrender of both Germany and Japan in 1945 provided the Allies with the opportunity to institute strict population control measures on the conquered nations of the Axis powers, without seeking anyone's permission. Japan, being the most hated enemy of the United States, had already been punished with 2 nuclear bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. To ensure that it did not rise from the ashes but stayed humble, the reconstruction included a nationwide plan of population control. As an island nation with limited natural resources, an already large population, and a modern economy whose industry demanded vast imports of foreign resources, Japan was the ideal testing ground for aggressive fluoridation, which was the only tried and tested fertility-depressing agent known at the time, fluoride. The Nazis had used it on the Jews and the Soviets on their Gulag prisoners, and was found to be not only extremely effective in sterilizing both men and women, but also in inducing a bovine state of obedience and submissiveness. In the cities, fluoride was put in the drinking water at every water treatment plant, while in the country, fluoride pills were distributed along with food rations. The work of poisoning the Japanese was accomplished by Japanese war criminals from Unit 731, which had performed lethal human experiments on civilians since 1937. The members of this unit, which was officially known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, were given immunity from criminal prosecution at war's end by General MacArthur, the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces. And instead of being executed for having murdered tens of thousands of innocent civilians in heinous experiments and torture, they were put to work on sterilizing their fellow nationals. The campaign was extraordinarily successful, and Japan became the only nation in the world not to have a baby boom generation after the war. The result of which, Japan also became the first nation in the world to have a larger number of retirees than children. As a reward for their service to the Allied depopulation effort, many of the scientists of Unit 731 were promoted to prominent careers in politics, academia, medicine, business, and especially in intelligence, aiding the United States biological weapons development program and forming the scientific avant-garde of what was to become the global depopulation policy. Germany and Italy, the other two major Axis powers, were subjected to similar population control measures, as a result of which they now occupy the unenviable second and third place on the list of nations with the most aged populations in the world. Japan's elderly, defined as 65 years of age and over, make up over 24% of the overall population, while in Germany and Italy, the elderly constitute nearly 22% and 21% of the population, respectively. That these three Axis powers are in this demographic position is obviously no coincidence, but the result of the deliberate and aggressive measures imposed on the vanquished by the victors, as soon as they unconditionally surrendered. The Axis powers served the Allies as guinea pigs, and the lessons learned on the citizens of these nations were soon applied on the citizens of the Allied powers themselves. The second aspect of nuclear weapons and the threat of assured mutual annihilation, as well as the establishment of military-industrial complexes. This second historical factor that has contributed to the secret, deceptive, and unlawful nature of the global depopulation policy is the militarization of the political and especially geopolitical climate post-World War II. The war had ensured that the armies of both sides had swelled to unprecedented numbers and absorbed large shares of their nation's GDP. On the Allied side, they were there to stay, while on the Axis side, the armed forces were dismantled along with the industry that equipped them. The conquered nations of Europe and Asia were placed under military administrations and depended on handouts from their former enemies for reconstruction. General Douglas MacArthur took charge of the supreme command of Allied powers, which occupied Japan from 1945 to 1952 and was assisted by British personnel to enact widespread military, political, economic, and social reforms. The post-war occupation of Europe, during which the Axis powers were demilitarized with the help of the English, the French, and the Soviets, and the ensuing Marshall Plan from 1948 to 1952, when they were helped to reconstruct, were both delegated by the US military. As in Japan, so in Europe, a military man was put in control. This time, and in this place, General George Marshall. A military mentality took root in the US, the Soviet Union, and the UK, and strong and all-pervasive intelligence agencies grew at the very heart of the political power structures of these three global powers, where they became firmly and irrevocably entrenched. In the decade following World War II, population control was conceived and implemented solely by the military personnel of the UK, US, and the USSR, whose intelligence agencies defined and ensured the program's secrecy and expediency, and who collaborated and cooperated with one another to solve crises and to avoid a nuclear conflict. As more nations joined the nuclear club, the probability and desirability of war between nuclear-armed nations became ever more remote, and emphasis shifted to the silent war of attrition waged covertly on civilians by their own militaries and governments, who made human fertility their primary enemy and target. The third factor to look at is that of the United Nations and the philosophy of using population control as a substitute to war in order to maintain international peace. Gradually, as its infrastructure was built up, the United Nations took over the responsibility for population control from the military of the Allied powers. But the methods and means had already been set and continued to be used covertly, while civil society and religious bodies tried to find moral justification for conventional methods of birth control, and primed and educated the public on the necessity for smaller families. The United Nations replaced the League of Nations, and like its defunct counterpart, its chief mission is to maintain world peace by promoting cooperation in solving international economic, social, and humanitarian problems. To achieve its goal, the UN has evolved over time and has grown to encompass 6 principal organs and 17 subsidiary agencies. The military-industrial complexes of the US, Russia, and the UK continue to be at the forefront of the battle against human fertility, and are charged with the task of conceiving and carrying out new methods for population control that violate national and international laws, with the full knowledge and consent of their nation's executive branches and the international community. The shift from military to civilian control of the depopulation policy has occurred gradually in the 1950s and 1960s, and while on the national level it is now overseen by the executive branch of every nation, internationally it is delegated and coordinated by the United Nations and its agencies, particularly the United Nations Development Fund, the UN Economic and Social Council, the World Health Organization, the World Bank Group, the International Monetary Fund, and the Food and Agriculture Organization. The primary concern of the United Nations and the pivotal issue for the international community is the global depopulation policy, which looms invisibly behind every structural adjustment loan and every development grant. Let us now look at the third set of obstacles that stood in the way of overt population control, namely international obstacles and the geopolitical dilemmas that they pose. The depopulation plan has proceeded in stages through a laborious process of persuasion and manipulation, and though it has come to encompass the entire world and affects nearly every individual on the planet, it has been concealed to this day due to several considerations. One, international consensus and national interest. Forging international consensus, despite irreconcilable differences and divergent national interests, is extremely difficult and best done discreetly between high-level national and international parties. To educate an entire nation takes generations, whereas to convince or co-opt a select number of individuals who already possess an understanding of political and geopolitical issues and who are more likely to set aside cultural prejudices and historical animosities, especially for personal gain, is a much easier and faster enterprise. The technocrats and scientists employed by the United Nations have therefore concentrated on co-opting their counterparts at the national level in key ministries once high-level envoys have successfully focused their attention on heads of state. The second aspect is that the fact that news travel faster than understanding, which calls for the need for secrecy. An enlightened country, or a country that has experienced population pressures for centuries, such as the Netherlands, for instance, could conceivably receive popular approval for legislating family size once it brings the issue out in the open and allows the media and civil society to discuss it freely. But in so doing, it would pass sensitive information beyond its borders to countries that are not ready for general consensus, and thus expose and jeopardize the covert methods that are in place. By a domino effect, the depopulation policy could be brought to a sudden halt throughout the world, and thus the countries where only secret methods of population control are possible and that are most likely to suffer from population pressures and resource scarcity would not benefit from proactive measures that, though painful and criminal, nevertheless enable such countries to survive the demographic transition from a growing to a stable population before they either collapse or collapse under the burden or are ready to accept and embrace legislation. Since news travel faster than understanding, the need for secrecy has remained paramount and has been respected by nations that have already undergone the painful demographic transition by covert chemical and biological means. The third aspect is that of the inglorious past of eugenics and the difficulty of controlling the instinct to procreate. The mere mention of population control brings back memories of the Holocaust and the Nazi eugenic agenda, which has tainted any and all efforts to institute enlightened and voluntary family planning measures. The inglorious past of eugenics acts as a barrier to benevolent population control. Furthermore, people have an innate aversion to the thought that the state should be allowed to have a say in our sex life, as this strikes at the heart of our instinct to breed, which is among the strongest instincts we possess. The fourth aspect is that of the logistics of moving billions. The world is a mighty big place, and a depopulation program is a complex, expensive, and labor-intensive project that cannot happen simultaneously across the globe. Problems of timing and coordinations have dictated a piecemeal approach. It is logistically impossible to proceed on all fronts at the same time And this has limited the United Nations and its wealthy sponsors to proceed gradually, whereby resources are focused on specific countries on any given decade. Once the program is established and national authorities can continue it with little outside assistance, then the international community shifts its focus to the next set of nations. It is thus that the global depopulation policy has advanced like a wave in the ocean and has succeeded in sweeping the entire globe. The fifth aspect is that of the social and psychological inertia. Countries and cultures are set in their ways, and it is difficult, if nay impossible, to thaw the social and psychological inertia that stands in the way of change, even if change is desperately needed. Europe's and North America's experience has shown that most Protestants were willing to accept contraception and abortion, whereas most Catholics and Orthodox were not. The Sunni and Shia sections that make up the vast majority of the Muslim world appear equally reluctant to accept any state interference with people's reproductive freedom. The same entrenched opposition to family planning appears throughout Africa, where the international community has advanced by force and with complete disregard for the people's well-being. Some cultures are more easily manipulated than others, and these places were the first to be subjected to population control. This explains why 90% of the population growth of the past half-century has occurred in the developing world. Well, it explains it, at least in part. There are several other factors. Westerners, in other words, did it to themselves and are now doing it to the rest of the world by hook or by crook, since non-Western countries are far less receptive to population control, regardless of the method used. The last set of obstacles that we have to look at are the current obstacles. While world leaders in the aftermath of World War II had no choice but to implement covert methods of population control, for the reasons I just described, world leaders today have no reason not to abandon these immoral methods and adopt legal means instead. The obstacles that stand in the way today are relatively minor compared to the insurmountable obstacles faced by their counterparts in the past. The first set of obstacles that stands in the way today are psychological. The global depopulation policy is unquestionably the most complex policy ever devised by man, and accepting it is no easy task, as it strikes at the heart of our humanity and confuses the boundary between right and wrong. By far, the most significant obstacle is the need to admit the 65-year-old history of covert chemical and biological population control methods, without which a reorientation of the policy to overt legislative methods is not possible. But who has the courage to stand in front of the world and tell people that they are at the receiving end of a global campaign of attrition and have been treated no better than an infestation of vermin for over 6 decades? Once having admitted to genocide and crimes against humanity, someone must assume responsibility and explain to the world why it was necessary and what would have happened had these measures not been taken. But who would assume this kamikaze duty? This is, after all, a genocide committed through sustained structural violence. It is not the work of a single tyrant or of a group of lunatics. It is the work of an entire system, an international system, a hydra with 1,000 heads. The fear of reprisals and of mass unrest deters even the bravest politician from telling the truth, especially when the truth is buried beneath layers and layers of deception, and is as evasive as a snowflake in the wind. And why would any world leader confess to crimes begun by past generations and then take responsibility for an inherited system of mass murder? It is easy to see why our best and brightest are waiting for an outsider to tell the truth, and why they hope that outsider will bear the brunt of the people's wrath, as the mob in its stupidity is inclined to want to kill the messenger. The second set of current obstacles are intellectual in nature. Since understanding the problem of overpopulation requires a geopolitical bent of mind and a bird's-eye view of the world, as well as the capacity to comprehend how a multiplicity of factors contribute to the overall picture, few people have the intellectual curiosity to follow the problem to its core. Fewer still have the stamina to want to find solutions, and the fewest have the courage to stick out their necks for an amorphous mass of 7 billion souls, all strangers. It is much easier to deny that overpopulation is humanity's greatest problem than it is to face it head on and accept that in the final analysis there are only two ways to solve it. Either we voluntarily restrict our own reproductive urges and limit our families to 2 children only, or the government will do it for us by any means necessary. Denying the problem is a way of deflecting responsibility, an intellectual cop-out. The human capital deterioration caused by the mass lowering of the IQ of entire nations through chemical agents has made it even more difficult for the average citizen, whose IQ would be sorely tested, to comprehend the complexity of the overpopulation dilemma. Who can explain the unexplainable? That is the question. And why risk being misunderstood? It is so much easier to throw one's hands in the air and hide behind the excuse that there is nothing a single man can do. And yet, what is required here is a single man, courageous enough to trust in the ability of humankind to rise to the occasion, sufficiently vocal to make everyone listen, and smart enough to make everyone understand. I don't know if I meet these requirements, but I sure as hell am trying. And so far, I'm the only one who has risen to the occasion and has grabbed this bull by the horns. The third set of current obstacles are emotional in nature. Be the change you want to see in the world, Mahatma Gandhi once said. But to be the change, one has to be emotionally invested. One has to care, and one has to care enough to want to sacrifice. The unpleasant reality is that the general public does not care about the distant future, and people are unwilling to make sacrifices for issues of no immediate concern to them. This, of course, is as much the result of people's indifference and apathy as it is a consequence of the campaign of misinformation the public has been subjected to for more than half a century by a leadership bent on deceiving rather than informing us. Faced with such an enormous problem, people would rather find scapegoats than having to assume responsibility. This human weakness translates on the political arena of the developing world in its refusal to admit that it has an overpopulation problem, so as to avoid having to overcome the painful moral struggle required by depopulation measures. While in the developed world, it translates into a refusal to change consumption patterns and a way of life that is hard to alter but clearly unsustainable. There are no heroes to be found when what is required is to throw oneself in front of a runaway train. there are no heroes to be found when the enemies that need to be faced are ignorance, prejudice, and apathy. And that is why the global depopulation policy continues in its original form, even though its methods are known to do as much harm as good.